All right.
Okay, that's it. Well, good morning, everyone. As I said, I'm David Schmiedicke. I'm the finance director for the city of Madison. And what I have for you today is an outlook on the 2025 city budget, give you some background on it, and kind of where we are, how we've gotten here, and possible paths forward. So this is about a common understanding of what we call the structural deficit. We'll get into what that means, some of the limitations on the city's budget, and some of the options, as I said, for moving forward. We have put together a 4-part information series, and which you can find. There's recordings and slides, as well as recordings and presentations made to the Common Council. But we basically try to lay a foundation for the budget, what we call the structural deficit, what that means, and then some strategies on the expenditure and revenue side.
How are we doing with the presentation?
Yeah, we're on a red here.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second,
My
folks.
apologies. Just want to make sure we're.
There we go. And you have the watch there. You can take it.
Yes.
See it.
Can everyone see it?
Dan Canelli, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Sorry to call you up, but you're a board member, so I figure I could.
Happy to have
All
it.
right. Glad everybody can see it. Amazing what technology.
I'm the only DMI employee working right now.
So we're on the agenda slide. Hopefully everybody can see that. Just a reminder, or for those of you who don't know, in terms of, the city has its vision of inclusion, or inclusive, innovative, and thriving, and our mission of highest quality service for the common good of our residents and visitors. So when the council went through these issues and tried to got the background on the budget, tried to center itself by looking and reminding itself of our values as a city in terms of equity, civic engagement, well-being, shared prosperity, and stewardship, as well as the service promise that we have for our fellow employees and for residents and visitors. You can find all this information at the city budget website, and it has as I said, all of the information series available, as well as the recordings of the meetings and presentations to the council. As I said, there's 4 parts to the series, and we'll get into each one on a very high level, and it lays the background on the budget. So the first is what we call budget foundations. When we talk about the budget deficit, it's really the general fund. The city has a number of different funds, and we'll get into that. But the focus there is because the property tax is the primary revenue stream for the general fund. The general fund supports all of our sort of services that you see every day: law enforcement, emergency medical services, parks, libraries, and so on. We are heavily reliant on property taxes. That is a function of state law. And no surprise, when we look at the budget, it's really all about personnel, the people who deliver services, as well as repaying debt issued to pay for the infrastructure in our city, with public safety and health being that largest functional area. So when we look at the general fund, just at the very basic level, a fund is a sum of money, and it's set aside for specific activities. The general fund is our primary operating fund. It also, when we talk about the budget, we also include the library fund because it is also primarily supported by the property tax. So when we talk about the city's budget, we really are talking about those 2 funds combined. We have a number of other funds. You can see some examples of those there: our debt service fund, capital projects, our enterprises such as the transit system, our water utility, Monona Terrace is its own fund. And those are really set up to sort of capture the revenues of those activities as well as the expenditures. And you can't really mix between the funds in terms of addressing deficits and things like that. So we'll be focusing on the general fund, and which is about $405 million for 2024. Over 70% of that comes from the property tax. You can see on that chart there, the division. 70%, we have some local revenues, which include fines and forfeitures. So when you pay a parking ticket, for example, those revenues go into the general fund. If you get a building permit, those revenues go into the general fund. A portion of the room tax goes into the general fund, is allowed under state law. That represents about 16% of the total revenues. State aid is about 11%. That includes what's called shared revenue. That's the sharing of income and sales taxes collected by the state with local governments. Transportation aid is another major portion of that. So that's the sharing of state gas tax and vehicle registration fees. And then at least for the 2024 budget, there's also some fund balance, basically money set aside that we have applied towards balancing the budget and maintaining current service levels. So that's the revenue side. When we look at the budget from a expenditure type, personnel is almost 2/3 of the budget. Again, no surprise there. It pays for the salaries of police officers, firefighters, parks workers, library employees, and so on. Our next largest is debt service. And so we issue debt to pay for capital projects, infrastructure investment, so road reconstruction, infrastructure in our parks, new buildings, for example, library buildings, and that gets repaid from the general fund and other funds. But in terms of the general fund, that's the second largest portion of allocations. Then we have some what are called purchase services and supplies. We have budgets to contract with non-governmental organizations, nonprofits that deliver services on behalf of the city, particularly in our community development area. And then there are subsidies provided from the general fund to some other activities such as transit, the city's share of the joint city-county public health agency. And then we do set aside money for sort of emergencies, what we call a contingent reserve. There's agency charges, so there's movement of some money back and forth, basically to cover some of the central activities like insurance and workers' compensation and fleet that moves between funds for those services provided between agencies and internal service charges. And then there are some revenues that are collected by agencies. It's a pretty small share of the budget. When we look at the budget on a functional area, I think no surprise, the largest share is public safety and health, followed by debt service. The rest of the budget is, the third largest share is public works. So again, no surprise, that's the snow plowing, collection of refuse, and the library is another portion of the budget. And you can see on this slide how the budget is allocated by function. It sometimes helps to put spending into context compared to other cities, in this case in Wisconsin. This table just gives some comparison of the 35 largest Wisconsin cities. It's difficult to make comparisons. We are much larger, other than Milwaukee, than any other city in the state. We're twice as large, more than twice as large as Green Bay, which is the third largest state, or it's the third largest city. So hard to make comparisons, but this is the comparison. We rank #1 in health and human services. Some of that is the impact of the federal aid for pandemic assistance. A lot of that went for health and human services activities. We rank high on transit. We run a transit system. In most places around the state, they either have very small transit or it might be run by the county, for example. We're high in libraries. Our debt service ranks relatively high. If you look at that last column where it says percent of average, that also gives you a sense of why we may rank high, how we sit relative to the average. So we're at about the average for law enforcement, a little bit higher for fire and EMS, a little bit higher on conservation and development. So that'd be housing investments, our forestry program, and about the average for what you would think on solid waste collection, general government, and then a little below average on highway maintenance and construction. We do spend more than other places in the state, and that does, I think, reflect the broad array of services that are delivered by the city compared to other places around the state. So in this first part of budget foundations, just some takeaways. General fund is the focus when we talk about the budget because of the property taxes. There are other funds, but transfers between these funds are either not allowed or heavily regulated. A good example of that is the water utility, where rates are set there through the State Public Service Commission, and the use of those funds are highly regulated. We are heavily reliant on property taxes. There are considerable limits on property taxes as well as other revenues for the city under state law. And then we talked about the largest expense categories, where a large share of our budget's on public safety and health. All right, now we're going to turn to the structural deficit and what that means. Some of the takeaways from this section will be revenues have not fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic, and really the city's revenues are not set up to capture some of that recovery that's occurred. Growth in expenses outpaces growth in revenues. That's our deficit. And then we'll talk a little bit about what cost to continue means, some of the assumptions, as well as some new state law requirements in terms of public or local spending on public safety. So we've had a persistent structural deficit for many years, and since really the advent of what we call strict levy limits, which occurred back in 2011. But it really is where our projected expenses are greater than our projected revenues, despite what's happening in the external economy. So our cost to continue the current sort of basket of services is higher than what we can bring in revenues each year under state law. Now, we were fortunate over the last few years to receive federal aid related to the pandemic and the economic effects of that. And we relied on that to maintain service levels, as well as service levels in other enterprise funds, such as Madison terrace, room tax activities, for example. And then we've also used other one-time monies. We've tapped into a little bit what we call our rainy day fund, or fund balance to help close gaps. When we look out into the future, this deficit continues, but it's quite a bit larger than we've seen in the past. We estimate right now an annual deficit of $27 million for the 2025 budget. And if we did nothing, which we can't really not do anything, but if we did nothing, that deficit would increase to over $60 million 5 years from now. This slide just gives a sense of we've had to do different things every year to address this structural deficit. And these are just some examples. I won't go into all of them, but we've increased fees such as the ambulance fee, the room tax has been increased. We've created new special charges for urban forestry. You see that on your municipal services bill or your water bill. We've created a new special charge for resource recovery, another term for recycling. We have changed cost structures. We redesigned the employees' health insurance plan so that they would have more co-insurance, more contributions to their health insurance. We had to do a number of things during the pandemic, such as the work share programs, try to capture federal dollars and things like that. So this is not something that sort of appeared out of nowhere. We've been dealing with this structural issue for many years and taken a lot of steps to try to balance that, really in response to these strict levy limits under state law, which, as I said, changed in 2011, where there used to be a minimum increase of 3% allowed. That changed to a 0% increase in 2011. And most places around the state, most communities are facing these types of challenges every year, like Madison is.
I'm sorry, when you said 3% went to 0%, that's allowable increases in property taxes?
Right. Yep. Yeah, when I say levy, that's interchangeable for property taxes. Yep. And then more recently, for the 2024 budget, the budget we're in right now, we had to take a number of steps. There was a 1% across the board reduction. This tried to respond to some recent underspending we've been seeing in agency budgets. So we feel, based on that sort of historical underspending, we thought agencies could address that without having to significantly address or reduce services. We also try to take into account a higher rate of turnover in positions, particularly in larger agencies. And then there was some expansion of room tax eligible activities, namely for the zoo and Old Brick Gardens. So that was about $6 million to balance the budget, but most of this was one-time money. The remaining funds that the city received on the American Rescue Plan Act, those have to be spent by the end of 2024. Whenever we close a tax increment district, sometimes there are surpluses available. And in this case, we have closed some with surpluses. It's a rare event, but that was also used to balance the budget. And then we, as I said earlier, we tapped our rainy day fund, our fund balance. And we do have a reserve target of about 15% of expenditures. We are fortunately now above that level. And so we do have some room, but these are one-time measures to balance the budget. Another major factor is we do continue to have a lasting impact on our revenues from the pandemic. This graph just shows a calculation that was put out by the U.S. Treasury in terms of establishing the allowable level of these ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act revenues we could use for our budget balancing activities. The darker bar is our what we call our counterfactual revenues, where our revenues would have been without the pandemic. The lighter shade line below that is where our revenues actually are. And when we sort of make that comparison in 2024, our revenues are about 9% below where they would have been otherwise without the pandemic. And that's despite the strong economic growth and so on that's occurred over the last couple of years, primarily because the city doesn't have a sales tax. For example, Dane County has a sales tax. It has been able to realize large increases in sales tax revenue. So has the state from sales and income tax. But because we have very constrained bundle of revenues available to the city and then the limits on property tax, we haven't seen that recovery. And that's a contributor to the deficit. So our gap is right now estimated to be 27 million. We're refining these numbers right now, so that gap could change. Probably won't change a lot, but it could change somewhat. And that's really a comparison of allowable increase in the levy limit and property taxes, basically what we think will happen with state aid. And then our sort of other revenue, what is expected to increase. And then comparing that to our expenditures, where we have to replace that one-time revenue, that's kind of the bottom shaded portion of the expenditure bar. We have personnel costs to address with pay increases, health insurance, and so on. Our debt service is expected to increase with the size of our capital budget, and then other costs on top of that. So you compare those two numbers, it's about a $27 million gap. Another complication in all of this is the legislature, in adopting an increase in shared revenue recently, which was a historic increase, no question about that. But they also tied to it some requirements. And one of those was a maintenance of effort for public safety. And basically for police and fire, we have to meet certain criteria, such as keeping the same number of personnel employed, or keep the same percentage of the budget, or the same amount of property tax allocated to it. If we don't meet those requirements, we could lose 15% of our shared revenue, which for Madison is about $1.2 million. So another consideration in trying to address the structural deficit is yet another mandate from the state. So some takeaways in this area. We have not fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the economic effects of that, because of state property tax limits, because of basically lack of access to other revenue sources under state law, in comparison to the state sitting on its largest surplus in history, county seeing, at least for the prior couple of years, pretty significant growth in their sales tax revenues. Our expenses outpace our growth in revenues. That's just to maintain current service levels. And when we look at our cost to continue, the one-time pandemic relief funding is coming to an end, and we have to meet those maintenance of effort requirements under state law. Now we'll turn to how do we address this? What are our options to balance the budget? And we'll start with the expenditure side. Probably no surprise, but we have to have a balanced budget. We can't operate like the federal government, have a deficit, and basically export that deficit to the rest of the world. We have to balance the budget each year. The connection between the capital budget and the operating budget is not as maybe direct as you might think. If we were to reduce our debt service, it does not address our deficit because of the way that the state law for property taxes works. And then our options for reducing expenditures includes reducing personnel costs. We could roll back new initiatives, but each of those is going to have significant operational impacts. So our gap is $27 million on the revenue side. We can obviously look to a very limited array of options. That includes new special charges. I mentioned our urban forestry special charge, our resource recovery. There are some options out there. We can increase our current bundle of local revenues, but again, that's only about 16% of our revenue stream. And with the property tax, the only option allowed under state law is really to go to the voters through a referendum if we want to increase the property tax above the allowable amount under state law. And as I tried to lay out, that is insufficient to maintain current service levels. On the expenditure side, of course, we could do an across-the-board reduction. We could roll back new programs. We could focus on positions and service reductions. And we could also look at reducing employee compensation in a number of different ways, all of which have consequences and impact on service levels. In terms of debt service, just some really basic points. We cannot cut debt service on already issued debt. We have to repay that. It's basically a contract we have with investors of the city. If we were to cut that, we would be in default, and that then leads to a whole cascade of other effects. So that idea, we can cut that part of the budget. I think pretty much everybody understands that. We cannot do that. When we look at the levy limit, that's basically our property taxes, which is, as I said, over 70% of the budget. The levy limit calculation, it's increased by what's called a net new construction factor, and that excludes debt service. And then you add debt service back. So long story short with all of that sort of calculation is that less debt service does not lower the allowable total property tax, or it does lower the allowable property tax, but it does not provide more operating revenue from the property tax. And so it does not address the structural deficit to reduce borrowing in the capital budget. It does reduce the overall tax level, which is a positive thing for some, but it does not sort of address our deficit caused by a lack of property tax revenues for operations. This just gives a sense of where the spending increases have occurred over the last few years. About $25 million has been added to the budget since 2021. And really that's primarily in cost of living adjustments as well as some new initiatives. So you can see the cost of living adjustments there. One other thing I should point out about state law is that under state law, police and fire commission staff, they can continue to collectively bargain. So basically they're unions, they collectively bargain, they have mediation and arbitration laws and so on that basically results in pay increases for police and fire that have to match comparable increases in other communities around the state as well as the economy. All that has to be accommodated under this levy limit. General municipal employees lost the right to collectively bargain in 2011 under what's called Act 10. And a gap had opened up between the rate of increase in pay for police and fire commission staff compared to general municipal employees. And mayors and councils have focused on trying to close that gap. So there have been some pay increases to catch up and close that gap, and was finally closed in the 2024 budget, as well as responding to, pretty significant increases, as you're all aware of, in inflation over the last couple of years, and maintaining compensation levels that are competitive in that environment. We've also added new positions for a number of activities. For example, a new Office of the Independent Monitor and Civilian Oversight Board of Police. We brought in the town of Madison, which added costs. We created the CARES program to respond to mental health type emergencies in lieu of sending law enforcement, and some other expansions around shelter operations. The whole impact of the pandemic on how we address homelessness has resulted in moving from what was a volunteer-oriented model and donated space to basically publicly constructed space and now paid employees to meet those needs. And that's an additional cost that needs to be addressed. Putting expenditure reductions in context, if we were to try to close this gap solely through expenditure reductions, what does 27 million mean? So if we looked at it in the context of an agency budget, it would mean eliminating, for example, the entire streets division. That's what 27 million is. So think about plowing snow and picking up trash and things like that. Our planning, community, and economic development agencies, so things like building inspection, economic development, planning, and so on, that's about $27 million. Or we could eliminate just about all of the central administration activities in the city. So finance, information technology, which all support services that the public sees every day. As a percentage of the total budget, if we exclude debt service, which we can't cut, it's about an 8% reduction. If we exclude public safety, that's a 15% reduction to everything else. And then when we look at it through the lens of positions, it's about 270 positions that would have to be eliminated. If we included public safety, that would be 10% of all positions. If public safety were excluded, that's 20% of all positions. On the salary side, about a 9% reduction across the board in salaries. If police and fire were excluded, that triples that amount of reduction. So again, trying to put these dollars into context of the budget. So some takeaways: the budget has to be balanced. We do have an executive budget process where the mayor submits a balanced budget to the council, and then the council makes amendments to that budget. Debt service and the level of it, while it affects the tax bill overall, does not affect the deficit because of the way that the state levy limit law works. And then our options for reducing expenditures are going to have significant effects if it's focused solely on expenditure reductions. So the other option is our revenues for balancing the budget. I'll just be very clear, when we look at what was a historic increase in shared revenue to local governments in last year's state aid legislation, Madison was considerably shortchanged. There's just no question about that. We have a limited number of non-property tax revenues, and there are trade-offs and equity considerations when we look at user fees versus increases in property taxes, which is a percentage of value. So again, putting revenues into context, federal aid, relatively high. Again, this is impacted by the pandemic. We are very reliant on property taxes, even compared to the rest of the state. And that kind of reflects Madison's sort of relative property value compared to the rest of the state. We have high property value. We're, I guess, sort of a relatively wealthier community than most of the rest of the state on average. We're higher on things like fines and forfeitures, penalties, total taxes. Our shared revenue, which you can see towards the bottom, we're at 47% of the state average, even below average for state highway aid, and so on. So our general revenues are higher than average, but a lot of that is because we're higher in terms of property taxes and in terms of this look, federal aid because of the pandemic. This picture just shows what I said before. We had got the lowest amount per capita per resident in the state compared to every other community. And you can just see the average, $142 per resident. We got less than $30 in terms of our shared revenue. Milwaukee's getting $407 per resident. And then there's a small community, it's outstate, that's getting over $1,000 per resident. We have very limited non-property tax revenues. We have what are called charges for services. One example of that are ambulance conveyance fees. We have licenses and permits. Building permits are probably the largest share of that. Fines and forfeitures, such as parking tickets. And then we do get a portion of the room tax. About 30% of the room tax comes to the city's general fund. The remaining 70% has to be spent on tourism-related activities under state law. And so our total local revenues are 55 million. So we would have to increase every single revenue by 50% just to close this gap. Again, to put that into context. Some of those areas we cannot increase 50% because they're user fees and they cannot be, we cannot charge more than the cost of the service. We do have special charges that are allowed under state law, and they can be used for the cost of a specific purpose for which a broad-based public benefit can be identified. New fees in the areas listed in that second bullet do not result in more revenue to the city, because under state law, if we were to charge a fee for that, we would have to reduce our allowable increase in property taxes by an equal amount. Some other possible options besides our current urban forestry and resource recovery special charges, you can see that there. Transportation is a possible area, possibly library services, parks, and about $1 per month per resident raises about $1 million in revenue. And so you need about $324 per year per resident. Right now, the total municipal services bill is about $85 per month. So we'd increase the bill by about 1/3 if this were all done through special charges. Property tax as an option in order to go above the state limits does require voter approval. The referendum ballot is very prescribed under state law, and the council would have to approve that through a resolution. In even numbered years, which is the year, obviously we're in even numbered year right now, the referendum has to be held at either the spring or fall primary or general election. So we've kind of passed some of those dates. And then a referendum allows either a one-time or ongoing levy increases, but that levy increase has to be a fixed dollar amount. It's not a percentage of the levy each year. So in terms of its effect in the budget, it gets decreased as a percentage of the budget every year as the budget continues to increase. And that's just a function of how it's set up under state law. So 27 million would be about $284 on the average value home, about a 9% additional increase above the levy limit for the city. And then just a reminder that when you look at your property tax bill, the city is about 1/3 of that bill. You also have the school district, the county, and Madison College on that bill. So just looking at that total bill, to add $284 to that on the average value home would add about 3.7% of an increase in that tax on the average value home. So there are some trade-offs. When we look at property taxes versus user fees, under property taxes, not all property pays property tax. So there are those that are excluded For example, nonprofit organizations, benevolent organizations, certain hospitals don't pay, just for some examples. Compared to user fees, for example, a special charge, all properties pay, whether they're taxable or tax exempt, because it's for a service being provided. When we look through an equity lens, the property tax is more progressive than a flat charge because it is a percentage of the value of the property, as opposed to a flat charge on the property, which is going to be a higher percent of someone's income that has a lower income level. So lower income property owners pay a higher share under a flat user fee, whereas it is somewhat more progressive. It's not as progressive, for example, as an income tax, but these are the options available to the city. In terms of relief for payers, under the property tax, we have something called the uniformity clause in the state constitution. So we cannot have targeted property tax relief on the tax bill. That's not allowed. There are some limited tax credits that apply to all property. And there are some city programs that provide assistance, basically reverse mortgage type programs. The city can provide relief to households for user fees and charges. We have a program called MADCAP that we just started. And so for low income and low moderate income individuals, they can apply to get some relief on their municipal services bill. We also have a fee waiver on ambulance charges as another example. So we have a limited number of non-property tax revenue options. We were shortchanged by the state in the recent shared revenue legislation. We have very limited local revenue options under state law. And we do have some options, but again, there's some equity considerations and some trade-offs that need to be taken into account. So some next steps with all of this. This will probably require multiple strategies to close this gap. Whether trying to close it all on expenditures is going to have significant dislocations and impact on services. We have to balance that with the effect of revenue increases and who pays and affordability. And then you can see at the bottom of this slide just the various options that will have to be under consideration as we move through this. Our budget timeline, just really quickly, we've started our capital budget process already a couple of weeks ago. Our operating budget process will start in June. That then moves into the agencies putting together their budget requests for 2025 based on instructions from the mayor. The mayor then reviews the budget over the summer, introduces a capital budget in September, and an operating budget in October, which is then reviewed by the city's finance committee. And then amendments are made by the finance committee to both budgets on those dates you see there. And then it moves to the full council where they can make amendments and then adopted by the budget or by the council the second week of November. If there were to be a referendum, for example, to increase the property tax, that general election date is November 5th. Right now, we're at a point in the process where the council has received briefings and has met in what's called a committee of the whole to discuss how to move forward. And they now are considering what's called a budget guidance resolution to kind of provide direction moving forward with the budget. And sort of the 6 key elements of that resolution is directing staff to do a number of different things. One is to evaluate service level and staffing and fiscal impact and efficiencies when they put together the 2025 budget requests. Look at options to reduce expenditures from cost to continue levels that would not compromise services to residents. Develop the language around a referendum for consideration by the council for a possible placing it on the November 5th election. Develop contingency plans in the event that a referendum, if it were to be considered, is not approved. look at this as a multi-year solution, or at least steps to address the ongoing structural deficit, because we have a deficit in 2025. We will continue to have deficits even if we solve that problem because of the way that the state law structure of our revenues compared to our cost to continue. And then we will be doing community engagement to talk with groups like yourselves, the public generally, residents, and engaging perhaps some consultants to help with that public engagement effort. So we have talked to the council. We met with them on February 13th, March 5th. This resolution has been introduced. It'll be considered by the council at their meeting on April 16th, and we'll continue to provide updates, and we'll be having community budget conversations with the council. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. You can find all this information and then some at our website, as well as we'll be holding budget conversations. The council will be throughout the month of May and early June. I think there's 5 meetings scheduled. So I've been doing a lot of talking. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Absolutely. We'll open up for questions. If you have questions virtually, send them in through the chat. Obviously, we can ask the questions here directly. I just want to say from DMI and myself as a taxpayer, this is a difficult situation, but your expertise and your knowledge gives me confidence that we will find solutions in this difficult moment. You've been a delight to work with for years. And I think we can say we have one of the best finance directors in the state. So thank you for all the work you're doing. It's not easy work, but it was an exciting presentation.
It was very helpful. Thank you.
All right, so we have questions. We have a couple of questions on line first. How did the pandemic cause Madison's revenue to be less than it otherwise would have been?
Sure, that's a great question. What we saw is declines in revenues, for example, from parking tickets. We don't have people coming downtown as much. We don't collect as much in terms of parking tickets. We lost a lot of room tax revenue for a few years. Now that's come back, but again, that money is gone in that portion of time. And on the flip side, because we don't have dynamic revenue sources like a local income tax or local sales tax, we can't capture that growth in economic activity. And so we're still locked into a pretty limited rate of growth in property taxes.
Next question is, will the council be adopting 2 budgets in case the referendum fails to be approved?
Yeah, that's a great question. We definitely will have contingency plans in place. They have to adopt 1 budget in the end, but we will have probably some form of a alternative approach that will be there in the event that the council decides not to pursue a referendum, or if the referendum, for example, were to fail.
Next question, last question right now for the chat, and then we'll open it up to the room. Are there options for selling any city real estate to raise revenue and end caretaking of some of these properties?
Again, a great question. We continue to look at ways of how can we offload assets. Again, that's a one-time revenue, which it helps us in the short term, but not in the long term of this issue. There are options to look at as well in terms of how can we monetize assets, maybe on an ongoing basis. There's these concepts out there called like urban wealth funds, things like that. So those are some ideas we'll pursue, but and continue to pursue, but those aren't going to sort of close this deficit.
One more.
Yeah.
Questions do keep coming in, but we'll get to the room here. Does increase in population from out-of-state folks moving here for jobs have any effect?
Again, a great question. We're seeing Madison's population. We have among the fastest rate of growth of any city in the state. You're all aware of that. We're going at about 1% annually. Our revenues on the property tax are tied to something called net new construction. And so that's the value of a new building, all the new construction in the city, divided by the total value of property in the city. That total value of property is growing faster than our new construction is because of home price appreciation and so on. And so we get maybe 2% of growth from that compared to costs, which have been going up. Inflation's been as high as 7%, it's come back down. So this growth in population, we would see more of that if we had a more diverse revenue stream.
One more that said, I believe that I saw the agents. Oh, they just keep firing it now. We'll get to you all in a second. I believe that I saw the budget requests are due 4/19, but the budget guidance won't be voted on until 4/16. Has the mayor provided guidance to the agencies in line with these ideas in the guidance resolution? And what kind of guidance has the mayor provided to agency heads for their budget requests?
Great question. So the date you saw in there was for the capital budget, which, as I said, doesn't have really a direct impact on the operating budget deficit that I just talked to you about. That process starts in June. So it does line up pretty well with what we're seeing with the resolution. In terms of the capital budget, the mayor really had direction to agencies that was an austerity budget from the capital budget perspective, saying, look, we have a capital improvement plan that was adopted for 2024. Let's focus on getting that done. And we have a 5-year capital improvement plan. Obviously we'll add a new year. That's where most of the focus should be, or to move projects between years if possible, but try to avoid adding new projects unless they're supported by things like federal dollars and non-general obligation debt, not property tax support.
We'll go to the room. We do have some more questions online, but to the room. Questions for Dave.
I'm just curious, just going back to 2011, because population hasn't increased so much. The staffing size grown with the population, or is that behind in a sense because it hasn't grown at the same rate as population?
Yeah,
that feeds then into, if we have to reduce everything by 15%,
right?
People may have the assumption we've been able to keep up in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we look at the number of city staff per sort of 10,000 residents, it's actually fallen 10% since 2011. So it has not kept pace. Now, some of that you maybe would expect to occur with efficiencies and things like that. But you look at a lot of areas of city government and, the staffing levels have not kept pace with population growth.
I think we have a question that a couple of people have put thumbs up on, is given that the new construction is key to increasing the levy limit and generates permit fees, is the city looking at ways to simplify or simply make the development approval process faster and easier?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that question a lot. I think that it's always a balance in Madison, right? Between, how do we preserve what we perceive to be our quality of life in Madison? And so how do we meet what's our zoning under all of that, as well as trying to streamline development of projects. I will say that even if we were to double net new construction in the city, that would only add about a couple $1 million to what we can increase the limit. So it's important to do that, but it's not going to solve this problem. And that has to be balanced, I think, with, what do we want our city to look like? And, how do we want development to occur? And, we obviously have processes in this city where we have public input and review and things like that. And so all of that needs to be, I think, taken into account.
I should add to DMI and Smart Growth. I know Bill Connors is going through a research project right now as part of our work for the Affordable Student Housing Task Force, part of the city's housing strategy and the city council's request to really understand the crisis we have in affordable housing. And we are almost at completion of a study of Madison and its surrounding neighboring cities on the pre and post entitlement process and the length of time. And it's been interesting research. We should have that out in the next week or so as we sort of finish this up. And I just want to say a big thanks to all the cities, Sun Prairie, Middleton, Fitchburg, Madison, that participated in this. So we should have that out. That also will give this information at our next committee meeting at the end of April to you all as well. Questions in the room?
I think going back to the staffing, I'm in the private sector. And so I think it's one of those, I think of all the different businesses and the owners that have really kind of scrutinized, AI, different things, processes, things like that. When was the last time we went through that process? I understand, percentage wise we're down, but when you also look at the opportunities for some of these different softwares and contract work and things like that. When did we last perform that exercise?
Well, we're constantly looking at those sorts of options. Obviously, things like AI, we need to kind of balance that with some of the ramifications of approaches like that. We also, I think, need to balance our residents often want to talk with people face to face, right, about certain things, and or want to hear somebody on the other end of the phone answer their questions. But we're constantly looking at that. Our information technology division or department is looking at those sorts of issues. I think the way we were, and everybody was able to transform under the pandemic from into a virtual meeting environment so quickly, I think is another good example of ways that we've addressed that. But I think the other thing is, we look at certain areas, let's say the fire department or the police department, which is a big share of what we do in the budget. People are concerned with response times and things like that, and so we have to have staff to do those sorts of things. So we do look at that, and we'll continue to look at that. This resolution that the council is considering is to look at those efficiencies and to try to employ those technologies where they can effectively, what they're doing is not so much reducing our staff, but trying to take up the additional service that we have to provide as the population grows.
So is it all done internally, or do you bring people in from the outside that, can shed a new light on it?
We do a little bit of both. I would say we bring in outside consultants, like in our information technology area, things like that. But yeah, I would say a lot of it's internal, but sometimes we do bring in outside folks. Great question.
One last question, a very quick answer, since we're at 9 o'clock. We rank number 1 in health and human service expenditures. Has there been no impact of consolidation with the county?
So a lot of that ranking is all the federal money that we got under the pandemic aid, the pandemic response aid. So things like emergency rental assistance, during the pandemic, that's all going away. And so it is a bit of an artificial level. We do have a joint city-county public health department. So in that sense, we have kind of eliminated some duplication of activity. But I will say that we do deliver more community and health-related type services in Madison than in other places, I would say, per capita. And again, that's sort of a value and priority judgment in our city in terms of assistance to homeless, community services type activities, and things like that.
Well, thank you, Dave, very much for being here. We really appreciate you giving this information. We're thankful to all of our members for joining us here. A couple of quick updates. This is a joint committee meeting. The next Government Relations Committee is already in less than a week's time. Someone that's actually on right now, Adam Barr, from our board of directors and a principal at Michael Best Strategies. We're talking about another big subject, the new Wisconsin state legislative maps. He's got a great presentation on it. To join us on Tuesday, April 2nd at 8 a.m. That's virtual. On April 18th, this committee will be meeting again here in hybrid format. We'll give you, I'll tell you who, I can't remember, to be honest with you, who our next presenter is. The top of my head. But then April 24th, a couple weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, we'll have our next What's Up Downtown breakfast at the beautiful Edgewater Hotel, 7:45 to 9 a.m. We'll have Wisconsin Athletic Director Chris McIntosh talking about the importance of athletics at downtown. So thank you all for joining us. Monday, any last words?
I think I'll just leave it. There was a profound something I wanted to share. We're already over, so
thank you all very much.
Happy Easter to everyone if you celebrate that.
Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.